In the 17th year of Qinghua, Empress Yu Xiaoro passed away in the south suburb monastery at the age of 29. The enchanting empress, who captivated two emperors, ultimately turned to mere soil and grass, leaving behind only a few sentences in historical records and a legendary tale. Yu Xiaoro was a renowned enchantress of the Daong dynasty. Her name echoed among the common people, in the martial world, and even in the court, finding its way into the meticulous accounts of the most upright historians. She was known for her flamboyant nature, arrogance due to royal favor, tyrannical behavior, and ruthless heart. These words fit her like a glove, seamlessly reflecting her persona, not to mention the rumors that ignited wild imaginations, proclaiming a life of extravagant allure. Yet, only two people knew the true desires of the enchantress Yu Xiaoro, the current emperor, Pei Lingjun, and Yu Xiaoro herself. Perhaps the world would not believe that the lifelong wish of the enchantress Yu Xiaoro was merely to be a virtuous wife and mother, to support her husband and raise children, and to witness the lights of 1,000 homes, living the ordinary life of a commoner. However, all of this was shattered completely when she turned 16. That year, shortly after ascending the throne, Emperor Pei Lingjun, weary from the persistent requests of his ministers to take an empress, took Yu Xiaoro's hand in despair. "Xiaoro, after much thought, the only one who can help me is you." As a royal dark guard who had spent 7 years closely accompanying Pei Lingjun, Yu Xiaoro, looking into his unfathomable eyes, trembled, and her delicate features instantly twisted with worry. "Your Majesty, please don't trap Xiaoro." She seemed to see her long, tragic fate reflected in his burning gaze. That night, Pei Lingjun dismissed everyone, closed the doors and windows, and negotiated with Yu Xiaoro until dawn. After countless reassurances, he finally received her extremely reluctant agreement. Having always prided herself as a child of the martial world, Yu Xiaoro, with tears in her eyes, sobbed while tugging at Pei Lingjun's sleeve. "Your Majesty, once this is done, please let me leave the palace and find me a suitable husband. To be honest, I think the Qin player from the former prince's residence would be a good choice." Relieved, Pei Lingjun embraced his future empress and comforted her. "Xiaoro, I see your sacrifices. Just rest assured, I won't forget my promise to you." Moonlight streamed through the window as the soon-to-be empress and the new emperor embraced, crying through the night, one from sorrow, the other from overwhelming joy. Soon after, a decree announced to the world that an obscure palace maid had overnight transformed into the empress of the Daong dynasty. What a shocking turn of events. At the grand ceremony for the coronation, when Pei Lingjun held his new empress's hand and delivered a heartfelt speech, it moved the crowd. They sighed quietly, realizing that the emperor and empress had known each other since their time at the prince's residence, where she had once saved him. But Yu Xiaoro coldly snorted, her murderous gaze sweeping across the dissenting ministers, making them tremble and lower their heads, unable to utter a word. From then on, Yu Xiaoro gained the emperor's favor and dominated the harem, steadily establishing her long reign as the enchantress. Yet only Xiaoro knew that, as she walked down the steps supported by Pei Lingjun amid the exploding fireworks, she was already drenched in cold sweat. With a hint of grievance, she glanced at the handsome face beside her, gritting her teeth and feeling utterly wronged as she murmured, "Your Majesty, you are trapping Xiaoro." Pei Lingjun was afflicted with a condition unlike any other in history. If what he had could be considered a disease, it should be called emotional apathy syndrome. Ever since he became aware of gender differences, he was horrified to discover that he had no concept of having a beloved. The moment of realization came when Empress Su wanted to select a crown princess for him. He was utterly terrified, unable to imagine sharing a bed with someone in the future. Thus, he found various reasons to politely decline. Through repeated experiments thereafter, he became increasingly certain he was ill. He wasn't attracted to women, nor was he attracted to men. He simply lacked the string of romantic feelings altogether. He had familial love for his father and mother, brotherly love for the other princes, friendship for his lifelong companions, and even a deep sense of reliance on Xiao, who had been by his side since childhood. But the one thing he lacked was love. He was a patient suffering from a deficiency of love, and the name of his illness was emotional apathy syndrome. After realizing his condition, Pei Lingjun fell into an intense internal struggle. He thought many times about telling his parents and asking them to strip him of his title as crown prince because he could never have a lover in this life, let alone populate the harem or produce heirs. No emperor of the Daong dynasty could ever be like him. And if it weren't for him, the most suitable person for the throne would be his younger brother, Pei Qishuan, born to the same Empress Su. One clear moonlit night, Pei Lingjun invited Pei Qishuan to the crown prince's residence. In the pavilion under the moon, he earnestly took his brother's hand. From appearance to character, from literary skills to martial prowess, he praised Pei Qishuan to the heavens before carefully concluding, "Brother Xian, you're so perfect. Would you consider becoming the crown prince?" Just as Pei Qishuan was basking in the compliments and drinking happily, he spat out a mouthful of wine in shock, his expression instantly panicked. "Brother, you're not joking, are you?" Pei Lingjun calmly wiped the wine off his face and leaned in closer to Pei Qishuan, his eyes sincere. "Brother Xian, I'm serious." Pei Qishuan's body trembled, and his handsome face immediately fell as if facing a great enemy. "Brother, you're my own brother." He was so anxious he nearly burst into tears. "You can't do this to your own flesh and blood." From then on, Pei Lingjun often heard similar complaints, especially from Xiao and Pei Qishuan, as if he had spent his entire life tormenting them. That night in the moonlit pavilion, Pei Lingjun had been genuinely stunned, never expecting such a response. But Pei Qishuan gritted his teeth, as if ready to make a monumental confession. Trembling, he leaned in close to Pei Lingjun's ear and, after taking a deep breath, whispered, "Brother, spare me, please. To be honest, brother, I actually have an illness." Pei Lingjun was instantly petrified. He turned his head in despair, his lips trembling for a long while before he finally spoke in hopeless tones. "Could it be venereal disease?" Pei Qishuan, caught off guard, turned red and started coughing violently. It wasn't Pei Lingjun's fault for immediately thinking of something so unspeakable. After all, his brother was flawless in everything except for his excessive indulgence in women. The number of his lovers was beyond count, as if he was trying to make up for the love Pei Lingjun lacked, twice over. Once Pei Qishuan finally caught his breath, he grimaced and revealed the truth. If his illness could be called an illness, it would have to be fear of the throne syndrome. Heaven knew how terrified he was of becoming the crown prince. The thought of standing at the forefront and bearing the burden of the nation's people filled him with dread. When the position of crown prince had not yet been decided, he had lived in constant fear. All he wanted was to be a carefree prince, living a life of leisure, indulging in pleasure, and freely enjoying the world. So when Pei Lingjun had cautiously broached the subject, Pei Qishuan had been scared out of his wits. "Brother, please don't say such things again. I'm a coward. I can't handle the scare." In the moonlit pavilion, Pei Lingjun stared at Pei Qishuan for a long time, taking in his face, so similar to his own. Finally, with a long sigh, he resigned himself with a bitter smile, saying, "Brother Xian, your illness is truly unique." As unique as his own. They were brothers, after all. Thus, the matter of replacing the crown prince was put to rest. Pei Qishuan became even more enthusiastic in supporting Pei Lingjun as emperor, fearing that his brother might fail in his duties. That night, Xiao, who had been quietly observing from the shadows, naturally overheard everything between the two brothers. She also learned of Pei Lingjun's illness, probably the only person in the entire palace who knew. At that moment, Pei Lingjun had no other solution. Exhausted, he could only wrap his arm around Xiao's waist and sigh, "We'll just take it one step at a time." Who could have known that taking it one step would turn into so many years? Prince Pei Qishuan's most hated person was none other than the fierce woman his elder brother, the Emperor Pei Lingjun, cherished, the wicked Empress Yu Xiaorou. She wasn't even beautiful, certainly not a woman of breathtaking beauty. At best, she was just decent looking. She had no real talents, couldn't recite the classics to save her life, and only knew how to wave a sword around. As for virtues, she had none. No, she was downright immoral. Pei Qishuan had never seen a woman as jealous as her. She was arrogant with the emperor's favor, monopolizing the harem and forbidding his brother from taking any concubines. She insisted that the emperor's eyes should only have her in them. How could she be serious? His elder brother, after all, was the Emperor of Daong. The worst part? This wicked empress was a barren hen. She couldn't and wouldn't bear children. And she still had the audacity to stop the emperor from taking concubines to produce heirs. Every time Pei Qishuan thought of this, his heart twisted in anguish. If his brother remained without an heir, it was obvious who would inherit the throne. And when that day came, it would be nothing short of a nightmare. While he was fretting and fuming, his brother seemed completely bewitched, deeply in love with that wicked woman, standing firm against all pressure and refusing to take even a single concubine. His devotion had even earned him a reputation among the people as a deeply affectionate ruler, while making that empress seem even more loathsome. The most infuriating incident happened not long ago. The envoys from Shilin Kingdom visited, and in addition to the annual tribute, they brought a few handsome young men as gifts. It was said that after seeing the emperor's empty harem, the king of Shilin suspected the emperor had different preferences and had carefully selected these men in the hopes of winning favor. For the sake of diplomacy, the emperor couldn't refuse, and during the banquet, he actually accepted the gift. But the wicked empress Yu Xiaorou, who sat beside him, fixed a fiery glare on the boys, as if she were ready to burn them alive. Pei Qishuan had worried for his brother then, and soon after, a shocking rumor spread through the palace. The empress had slapped the emperor during an argument in the royal bedchamber. What? That damned witch. Enraged, Pei Qishuan couldn't sit still. He grabbed the sword hanging on his wall and rushed to the palace, determined to rid the emperor of this treacherous woman. Along the way, a palace servant recounted the entire conversation he'd overheard while standing outside the door. Although the doors were closed, the argument inside had been so fierce that the servants outside couldn't help but hear. The emperor seemed to be speaking softly, trying to soothe the empress. But at some point, she exploded in fury, her temper flaring as she reportedly pointed a finger at the emperor and cursed. "Does your majesty not think you've gone too far? I am a woman too. Have you ever considered my feelings? I'm done with this. I can't bear staying in this palace for another moment." Pei Qishuan slapped his sword hilt in frustration. If she can't bear it, then let her get out. His outburst startled the servant, who gulped and continued his story. The emperor, likely worried something serious might happen, had moved to cover the empress's mouth, but she struggled fiercely. Then, a sharp sound echoed from within the room. Everyone outside had been shocked. The head steward, unable to hold back, had rushed in with the servants, and there they found the emperor, a clear handprint on his face, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Meanwhile, the perpetrator snorted coldly and made to leave, throwing down one last shocking order. "Bring those Shilin boys to my chambers." The head steward had wondered if his ears were playing tricks on him. But the empress had turned back and shouted in fury. "Did you not hear me? Male concubines. I want them as male concubines." Everyone in the room had gasped audibly, their jaws dropping in disbelief. Who could have imagined that this wicked empress was so shameless? In the dead of night, Pei Qishuan sat beside Pei Lingjun's bed, his eyes red-rimmed as his trembling hands carefully applied ointment to his brother's injuries. At first, Pei Qishuan had been furious, storming into the palace with his sword, intent on killing that wicked empress, Yu Xiaorou. Yet, to his surprise, he couldn't find any trace of her. Instead, he was stopped by the imperial guards and brought before Pei Lingjun. "Xian, you were far too reckless. You nearly caused a disaster, Pei Lingjun said, still shaken, as he gripped his younger brother's hand tightly. If anything happens to Xiao, I won't go on living. Do you understand? Pei Qishuan was both angry and helpless, forced to grudgingly agree, but he clenched his fists tightly. If that vile woman ever dares betray you, even if it costs me my life, I'll make her pay. Pei Lingjun found himself torn between exasperation and amusement at his brother's misplaced loyalty. He sighed, realizing he had perhaps gone too far in his earlier performance, but he couldn't reveal the truth. Instead, he gently reassured Pei Qishuan. Don't worry, Xian. Xiao was only angry at me. She didn't touch those boys. She's already dismissed them, scattering them throughout the palace. After a pause, Pei Lingjun added earnestly, Xian, don't mention deposing the empress again. I can't live without Xiao. Of course, how could he live without her? If not for her playing the villain, shielding him from all the overt and covert threats, how would he deceive the world? How would he hide his affliction and protect the royal family's reputation? Thanks to her, he had the perfect excuse to leave the harem empty and enjoy peace and quiet, all while earning the flattering title of a faithful and unwavering lover. In truth, he was selfish. Xiao had been right. In this lifetime, he had wronged her. He had forced her into the role of the wicked empress, the infamous villain. She shouldered all the blame while he preserved his illustrious reputation. Even if he never had an heir, no one could fault him for it. History would remember him as the deeply loving yet tragically misunderstood emperor. This singular blemish on his record would evoke sympathy, not disdain, and thus, he would uphold the Pei family's honor. When the day came for him to descend to the underworld, he would be able to face his ancestors with a clear conscience. The only person he had truly wronged was Yu Xiao, the kind-hearted, gentle woman who never wanted to be trapped in the palace, whose greatest wish had been to live as a good wife and mother. Thinking of her, Pei Lingjun let out a long sigh, closing his eyes as he leaned against the edge of the bed. In the end, it is I who owe her everything. In the dead of night, with the wind blowing across the lake's surface, there sat the recently disgraced empress, Yu Xiao, utterly intoxicated. Resting her chin on her hand, her cheeks flushed, she gazed dreamily at the shimmering water, a silly smile on her lips. During the earlier quarrel in the palace, there had been a moment when she was not merely acting. She genuinely felt like giving up. What was it all for? After so many years, she was truly exhausted. If she wanted to leave the palace, escaping her confinement wouldn't be difficult for someone with her skills. But the emperor kept sweet-talking her, promising that he would let her go once the kingdom was stable or once a better candidate came along to replace her. When would that stability ever come? When would a better replacement ever appear? It felt like she was being tricked day after day, year after year. That slap she had delivered earlier had indeed been with all her strength. Her palms still stung. Serving you right, she muttered to herself before breaking into giggles, her face rosy, like a child who hadn't received their candy, soft and vulnerable under the moonlight. At that moment, Pei Qishuan happened to wander into the secluded spot while taking a stroll to clear his mind. After watching his brother sleep, he had left, troubled and wandering aimlessly through the vast palace, inadvertently ending up here, only to run into his nemesis, the empress. Initially, he didn't recognize her. Normally, she was heavily made up, adorned in luxurious clothing, her chin held high with an air of arrogance. Tonight, however, she was stripped of her usual glamour, her long hair cascaded down, and she wore a simple white dress, her slender figure appearing fragile in the wind. Her pale face glowed faintly with a blush, and beneath the moonlight, she was laughing foolishly, exuding an unexpected gracefulness. Pei Qishuan had to admit, this version of Yu Xiao felt strangely unfamiliar, yet oddly endearing. They rarely had direct encounters. Usually, they only exchanged polite greetings at banquets, calling each other sister-in-law. Now, seeing her alone, the once formidable empress appeared softer, displaying the vulnerability of a young girl. In her drunken state, it was clear she was still affected by the matter of the beautiful boy sent from Shilin, driven by jealousy born of love, which could be seen as a kind of devotion. Yet an opportunity like this was rare. After all, she was still the empress. He shouldn't soften his heart. Should he just slap her and run to avenge his brother? Lost in thought, Pei Qishuan was suddenly startled by a loud crash. He turned to see the drunken Yu Xiaoro throwing down a wine jar and picking up a dry branch, brandishing it like a sword in the night wind. She was practicing swordplay? He figured that was the only thing she could really show off. To wield a branch with such elegance was impressive. Pei Qishuan, who had his own martial arts skills, found himself appreciating the sight, standing in the shadows with his lantern, watching intently. If he knew what Yu Xiaoro was thinking at that moment, he would have jumped out to scold her. Shameless woman. Indeed, Yu Xiaoro was thinking about a man, but not her own. Would it be alright for you to teach me how to play the guqin, sir? Although I'm a simple girl, I've admired you for a long time. Under the moonlight, with the wind swirling around her, Yu Xiaoro seemed lost in a trance, forgetting her age and the present moment, weaving together her drunken words and unspoken feelings as she brandished her makeshift sword. The guqin teacher she admired was a refined young man named Lu. Back in the Crown Prince's residence, she had loved to steal glances at him playing the guqin. In the golden hues of the setting sun, time felt suspended in the delicate movement of his long fingers, each note a sparkling moment of joy, pure and unspoken happiness. That was the life she longed for, simple and inexplicably happy. After becoming empress, she had summoned that guqin teacher, but perhaps because of her infamous reputation, he trembled in her presence, eager to escape. That had saddened her deeply. Before the song was finished, she had dismissed him, and she could see the relief on his face as he left. Alone afterward, she had curled up on her bed, her makeup smudged from crying, feeling like a pitiful joke in the mirror. Until Pei Lingjun arrived, cradling her in his arms as she sobbed uncontrollably. He was perceptive enough to understand her pain without asking. They were the closest to each other, sharing a bond built over years, and while there was no fiery love, there was a mutual understanding and care. After that episode of tears, Yu Xiaoro had seemed to let go, no longer fixated on her feelings. She resumed her cold, proud facade, becoming the wicked empress, shielding Pei Lingjun from storms and other women. And now, she had to shield him from men too. The more she thought about it, the more aggrieved she became. Her swordplay grew fiercer, her eyes stinging, tears pooling as the alcohol's effects began to take hold. Just as she swayed, about to stumble, a light approached her from afar. A figure carrying a lantern walked closer, surrounded by a soft glow. His handsome features were striking, reminiscent of the stars above, and for some reason, he felt familiar. "Is it you, sir?" Her heart raced as an overwhelming tide of emotion washed over her. The man paused in front of her, hesitating before asking, "Why are you crying?" Rumors about the infamous Empress Yu Xiaoro's promiscuity and her notorious fondness for seducing men had been widespread, but little did anyone know that Yu Xiaoro, even now, was still untouched, so innocent that she hadn't even experienced a kiss. So, when she couldn't restrain herself any longer and clung to the man before her, kissing his enticing lips in a clumsy, frantic manner, she let out a soft, satisfied murmur, feeling as if her life was finally complete. With a loud crash, the lantern fell to the ground. Pei Qishuan, who had just been forcefully kissed, stood dazed in the moonlight. By the time he recovered, Yu Xiaoro had already locked him in a firm embrace, their lips pressed together so forcefully that he found himself unable to break free. His head spun as despair crept in. She was indeed the notorious empress, famed for her ruthless charm, but to his dismay, this time it was him who had fallen victim to her aggressive seduction. "Your Highness, please control yourself." In their struggle, their clothes became more disheveled. Breathing heavily, Pei Qishuan gritted his teeth and slapped Yu Xiaoro, leaving her dazed and disoriented. Her arm caught on a tree branch, and with a ripping sound, her sleeve tore, revealing a pale, delicate arm. On it, a striking red mark caught Pei Qishuan's attention. He froze in disbelief. He stepped forward, reaching out to examine the mark more closely, but Yu Xiaoro, half sober from the slap, opened her eyes and saw his face inches away. Startled, she stepped back, her heart racing. Say seventh uncle. Fragments of the chaotic events rushed through Yu Xiaoro's mind, and she realized what she had done to Pei Qishuan. Overcome with regret, she felt as though she could bite off her own tongue. In her panic, she turned to flee, but Pei Qishuan quickly grabbed her. Wait for what? She couldn't afford to add adultery with the emperor's uncle to her list of crimes. Yu Xiaoro fought off Pei Qishuan's grip with a few quick moves, leaving him behind with a hasty, "Forgive me for my drunken misconduct, seventh uncle." She hitched up her dress and fled into the night, stumbling as she disappeared into the shadows. Pei Qishuan, both amused and exasperated, called out a few times before stomping his foot in frustration. As he watched her figure vanish, his expression grew more serious under the moonlight. If he hadn't seen it wrong, that red mark on Yu Xiaoro's arm, it was unmistakably a shigangsha, a sign of her chastity. Could it be that the notorious Empress Yu Xiaoro was, in fact, still a virgin? Unable to make sense of it, Pei Qishuan was left in deep contemplation. Eventually, his curiosity got the better of him, and he made his way to the palace, seeking out Pei Lingjun, who was in the midst of reviewing official documents in the Bao Hua Hall. They spoke from noon until dusk, but no one knew what was discussed. When Pei Qishuan finally emerged from the palace, his usually handsome face appeared pale and his eyes dim. Bathed in the glow of the setting sun, he stared ahead blankly, feeling as though he were walking through water, each step heavy and uncertain. He hadn't gone far when he found himself face to face with none other than Empress Yu Xiaoro, dressed in resplendent robes, her ink-black hair cascading like a waterfall, her makeup still as elaborate as ever. Her eyes flickered with panic upon seeing him, though she quickly masked it, nodding at him with a courteous yet distant manner before trying to slip past him into the hall. But as they brushed shoulders, Pei Qishuan couldn't hold back any longer. He sighed softly in her ear. "Stop pretending. I know everything." Yu Xiaoro lifted her head abruptly, her expression one of shock. She met his gaze, a gaze filled with sympathy, regret, and sorrow, all swirling with complex emotions. In that moment, she understood everything. Her throat tightened, and she couldn't muster a single word. Inside the hall, Pei Lingjun had appeared at the door at some point, observing the scene. The three of them stood frozen in the twilight, their figures bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, motionless for what seemed like an eternity. On that day, the radiance of the sunset enveloped Bao Hua Hall, the breeze gently brushing their faces. Time itself seemed to pause, stretching on far beyond dusk, far beyond the fleeting years of their youth. Do you intend to live like this forever? 3 years later, at the royal hunting grounds, Pei Qishuan walked by the riverbank with his horse, side by side with Yu Xiaoro, both under the shade of the trees. Since the secret had been uncovered, their relationship had subtly changed. Pei Qishuan's initial loathing for the so-called Demon Queen had shifted to sympathy for someone tricked by his brother. "In this matter, my brother truly wronged you." He started visiting the palace frequently, bringing Yu Xiaoro curious items, or searching for popular folk tales to entertain her. He even gave her rare swords, and they would practice martial arts in the bamboo forest together. At first, Pei Qishuan only wanted to compensate for the wrong done to her, but over time, something began to grow inside him. Seeing her smile warmed his heart, as though a flower had bloomed within him. Originally, he wanted to live as a carefree prince, wandering the lands, but during these 3 years, he hadn't taken a single step out of the capital. He couldn't explain when he began feeling tied to her. The words his brother had said in the Bao Hua Palace 3 years ago were what made it impossible for him to leave. Only then did he truly understand that, No matter how unwilling, as a son of the imperial family, a man of the Pei clan, he was born with duties. He had to protect the people of De Yong and safeguard the empire that had stood for centuries. So, Xiao, both of us are trapped. Our hearts are not our own. Under the trees by the river, their silhouettes stood side by side, gazing at the shimmering water, both lost in silence. That silence didn't last long, as a sudden sharp shout pierced the sky from afar. Assassins! Protect the emperor! Pei Qishuan and Yu Xiaorou's eyes widened in shock. They exchanged a glance before jumping on their horses and rushing toward Pei Lingjuan's camp. In the distance, the clash of swords and cries of battle echoed through the air, carrying the scent of blood. Yu Xiaorou's heart pounded like a drum, and she trembled in Pei Qishuan's arms with a fear she had never known before. That moment was like falling into an abyss, plunging into a nightmare from which there would be no escape. In the 29th year of Yunda, the alliance between Beiwei and De Yong was shattered. Beiwei launched a surprise attack on Emperor Pei at the royal hunting grounds. The two sides fought fiercely, and Emperor Pei was gravely injured. He died from his wounds, leaving an edict naming Prince Qishuan as his successor. The empire mourned. Meanwhile, war with Beiwei was imminent. When Yu Xiaorou burst into the morning hall, the rain was pouring outside, and she had staggered all the way there, with servants struggling to keep up. She finally reached the hall, only to see Pei Qishuan kneeling in front of the altar. She blinked, her drenched body trembling uncontrollably, still feeling as if it were all a dream. Water dripped down her forehead, running over a hideous scar left from the battle. She had slept for days after the fight, only to wake up to the devastating news. The emperor was dead, Beiwei was invading, and De Yong was on the brink of unprecedented disaster. How absurd! Life was nothing but a fleeting dream, and despite all her struggles, it amounted to nothing. At 9, she had entered the crown prince's manor as a secret guard. 7 years later, at 16, she became empress. After 8 years on the throne, at the age of 24, an unexpected assassination had left her a widow, making her the youngest Empress Dowager in De Yong's history. Empress, no. Empress Dowager, please accept my condolences. Pei Qishuan, struggling to adjust his form of address, had red eyes. He stepped forward, trying to support the pale Yu Xiaorou, but she flinched violently, pushing him away with a heart-wrenching scream. You liar!
Pei Lingjuan, get up!
That fragile figure hurled herself at the coffin, attempting to push open the lid and pull out the late emperor's body. Everyone gasped and rushed forward to stop her. In the chaos, Pei Qishuan, afraid she would hurt herself, roared, "Everyone leave." The hall doors slammed shut, cutting off the torrential rain outside, but leaving behind a desolate stillness within. Pei Qishuan hurriedly pulled the hysterical Yu Xiaorou away from the coffin. "Xiaorou, don't do this. My brother is really gone. Please calm down." Yu Xiaorou, with her hair disheveled and face streaked with tears, sobbed until she was out of breath. She struggled desperately in Pei Qishuan's arms, trying repeatedly to reach the coffin, only to be firmly restrained each time. She cried out in anguish, "Pei Lingjun, you liar! Didn't you say that once the kingdom was stable, you'd let me leave the palace? Didn't you say you'd find me a husband I could love? Didn't you say you'd be the godfather to my children? How could you just leave me like this? You've ruined my life. Wake up. You can't leave me." Her piercing wails echoed alongside the storm outside, cutting through Pei Qishuan's heart like a knife. Choking back his own sobs, he whispered, "Xiaorou, please stop.
You still have me.
Whatever my brother owed you, I will repay. I won't abandon you." He held her tightly, as though trying to fuse her into his very bones. In the vast, dimly lit hall, a feeling of mutual dependence began to grow between them, for both had just lost the one person who was irreplaceable in their lives. That person had been intertwined with their fates, engraved into their souls. And now, their paths had irrevocably shifted. One had become an Empress Dowager, the other an emperor, both against their will. Life was but a fleeting dream, and yet, from that moment onward, their fates were tightly bound together, leaning on one another, inseparable. After ascending the throne, Pei Qishuan led a personal expedition against Beiyue. With De Yong's morale soaring, they conquered 12 strongholds in one swift campaign. 2 months later, he returned triumphantly. It was already deep winter then. Amidst the icy winds and snowy landscape, a slender figure stood draped in mink, her long hair cascading like a waterfall. Sensing something, she slowly turned. At that very moment, Pei Qishuan, still in his battle armor, felt his eyes sting, his vision blurring with emotion. They stood far apart, gazing at each other through the storm, but nothing could sever the bond that ran deep in their veins. You're back. As the Empress Dowager, Yu Xiaoro stood there with her dark eyes and bare face, no longer needing elaborate makeup. Despite the scar on her pale forehead, she remained serene and graceful, like a lotus swaying gently on the water. Pei Qishuan gripped the hilt of his sword, slowly walking towards her, snowflakes lightly dusting his handsome face. Without thinking, he reached out and pulled her into his arms, nodding heavily. Yes, I'm back. Back, and I'll never leave you again. He felt her stiffen, then slowly return the embrace. Warm breaths dampened his clothes, and Pei Qishuan closed his eyes, overwhelmed by an indescribable ache. He knew all her fears, her anxieties. Alone in the vast palace, without husband, child, or home, she had no one left to trust, no one to rely on, no one to summon the courage to love, except him. Xiaoro, let me give you a home, will you? For a moment, Pei Qishuan wished time would stop right here, at this instant when she smiled through her tears and nodded. He wished they could stay frozen in this moment forever, never moving forward. But fate is never in one's control. He tried everything to give her the chance to be a virtuous wife and mother, to give her a real home, but the world refused, unwilling, unyielding. Words of condemnation often cut deeper than swords. Rumors began to spread. As Pei Qishuan spent more and more time at the Empress Dowager's chambers, even staying overnight once, the gossip reached its peak. A mass of officials gathered, kneeling outside the hall from dawn until noon, demanding the new emperor come out and explain himself. They came with righteous indignation, led by 3 senior historians, denouncing the demon empress with a list of nearly 100 alleged sins. The most damning of all, seducing the new emperor, defying all ethics, and corrupting the royal harem. Even before Emperor Lingjuan's death, the court had viewed Yu Xiaoro as a femme fatale. Now seeing her captivate the new emperor as well, their fear intensified, wishing they could execute this demon empress right in front of the palace gates to pacify the nation. When Pei Qishuan finally emerged with Xiaoro at his side, he was exhausted. His gaze swept over the officials as he spoke slowly. The late emperor had barely passed, and already you can't wait to act. A list of 100 crimes for the demon empress? Excellent. His eyes narrowed, voice suddenly sharp. What? Do you take the Empress Dowager for a helpless widow? His rebuke resounded like thunder, startling the crowd into silence. Trembling, they cried in unison, Your Majesty, we dare not. Last night had been unremarkable, just an ordinary, starless night. Yet it was the anniversary of Pei Qishuan and Xiaoro's lakeside encounter. Reminiscing about the past, they drank a little too much, falling asleep in each other's arms, fully clothed. But waking up to the uproar outside, all demanding the demon empress be removed and the royal line restored, Pei Qishuan had grown restless, reluctant to face them. Still, avoidance was impossible. He gripped Xiaoro's hand firmly, his gaze unwavering. Let's take this chance to clarify everything. I want to marry you, make you my empress. We'll stand together openly. I want to give you a home, with children by your side, so you'll never be alone again. Will you? Yu Xiaoro smiled faintly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, then leaned into his chest, nodding gently. Pei Qishuan was overjoyed, failing to notice the fleeting sorrow in her eyes. "You all listen," he declared. "I am not here because I fear you, but to announce a decision, a proper resolution for your so-called demon empress. I have decided." The officials held their breath, gazing up in anticipation, when a cool, clear voice cut through the air, interrupting Pei Qishuan. "His Majesty has decided to build a nunnery for me on the southern outskirts of the capital, where I will live in seclusion, devoting myself to prayer for the late emperor and the future of Dayong. I will never step foot in the palace again." Like a stone dropped into a calm lake, her words caused a ripple of shock. Pei Qishuan trembled, his voice breaking in disbelief. "Xiaoro, you." Of all those present, only the Empress Dowager, Yu Xiaoro, stood calmly, her gaze steady, though her face was slightly pale. The three historians were the first to react, raising their arms and shouting, "Long live His Majesty! Long live the Emperor!" The officials finally came to their senses, joining in with cheers of joy. But as the jubilant cries echoed around him, Pei Qishuan's face grew paler by the second. Stunned, confused, angry, heartbroken, his emotions flashed in his dark eyes before finally dissolving into silent pain amidst the falling snow. His throat tightened as he reached out to Xiaoro, but her slender figure took a step back, her head bowed, hiding the glimmer of tears in her eyes. So close, yet forever out of reach. As the wind howled mournfully, Pei Qishuan remembered his words to her during the hunt. "So, Xiaoro, we are both powerless, both bound by our hearts." Back then, it had been spring. He had walked beside her along the riverbank, leading his horse, watching the sunlight shimmer on the water, thinking there would be more springs, summers, autumns, and winters. After this winter, they would see the peach blossoms bloom again. When the news spread that the emperor was to marry the prime minister's daughter, it was already the Lantern Festival of the following year. The streets were bustling with fireworks and festivities, while the palace was in the midst of preparations for the grand wedding. Yet, despite his upcoming nuptials, Pei Qishuan felt no joy. Cloaked in a heavy cape, he quietly left the palace. He went to the temple on the southern outskirts, searching for her. Finally, in the lonely tower on the back mountain, he found Yu Xiaoro, gazing at the fireworks in a trance. She was dressed simply, her long hair flowing, her figure still as delicate as ever. Resting her chin on her hand, she looked like an innocent girl under the moonlight, untouched by the world's troubles. Perhaps she had secretly drunk some wine. Her eyes were misty, her cheeks flushed, resembling that time by the lake when she drank alone, giggling softly, her voice sweet and soft. Pei Qishuan approached her step by step, his hands trembling as his eyes became moist. He could no longer remember what night it was or what year they were in. "My lifelong wish has always been to be a virtuous wife and loving mother, to support my husband, teach my children, and watch the lights of 10,000 homes, living an ordinary life." On the lonely tower, Yu Xiaoro once again spoke of her old wish, her heart still filled with yearning. Neither of them spoke of the upcoming wedding. They simply reminisced, talking about the past. By the end, both seemed tipsy, leaning on each other as they laughed and cursed the heavens. "Pei Lingjun, you old bastard. You've really been dedicated to ruining my life." Laughing and cursing, they lost their balance and tumbled to the ground in a heap. The fireworks flew farther and farther, carried away by the sound of their laughter. After a long while, Yu Xiaoro lifted her head from Pei Qishuan's chest. A smile still lingered on her lips, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Like a little girl begging for candy, she tugged playfully on his sleeve. "Qishuan, let's go to the night market, all right? It's so lively outside. We can pretend to be commoners and just..." The unspoken wish finally slipped out, so soft and tentative that Pei Qishuan could not bring himself to refuse, nor did he want to. "Just be husband and wife for one night, okay?" With a loud bang, fireworks burst into dazzling colors overhead. Pei Qishuan and Yu Xiaoro wore masks as they strolled through the crowded night market, their fingers tightly intertwined. They leaned on each other, as if they'd never let go. They watched performances, tied red strings of fate, and released lanterns. Like any ordinary couple, they enjoyed every moment to the fullest. Finally, they climbed onto a rooftop and leaned against each other, gazing at the stars. The night seemed to stretch on like a lifetime, yet a lifetime felt as fleeting as a single night. It was only when the sky began to brighten that they quietly returned to the temple, unwillingly saying their goodbyes inside the room. But just as Pei Qishuan pulled his cloak tighter and prepared to leave, Yu Xiaoro suddenly rushed forward, embracing him tightly from behind. The room fell into an abrupt silence. She pressed her cheek against his back, whispering his name through her tears, her voice choked with sobs. Qishuan, I want to have a child with you. It was truly a foolish desire. Having seen the stars, she now longed for the moon. Having the moon, she wished for the sun. Yet even with the sun, her heart still felt hollow, as though not even the brightest light could penetrate it. Humans are always so greedy, like beasts driven by thirst, never satisfied, always seeking more. Knowing it's impossible, yet striving for it, it's foolish, reckless, and senseless. Yet there is no regret, no resentment, for in this fleeting lifetime, one must allow themselves to indulge, even if only once. As the curtain fell, their figures intertwined on the bed, pale arms marked with crimson, lost in a passion that asked nothing of tomorrow. The news of the Empress Dowager's pregnancy spread like wildfire through the capital, stirring endless speculation. Historians, known for their intolerance of scandal, began their relentless protests once again. Overnight, they drafted accusations and knelt before the Xianing Hall, passionately urging the emperor to grant the Empress Dowager at the Southern Temple the same fate as silk or poison, to protect the royal family's honor. This time, Pei Qishuan did not bother with politeness. He stormed out, kicking over the nearest official. Get lost. If any of you dare speak again, I'll make sure you receive both fates first. With the emperor's command, no one dared disturb the Southern Temple again. Despite the slanderous rumors that continued to circulate, they meant little to him, and even less to her. Those were perhaps Yu Xiaoro's most peaceful days, filled with quiet joy. She chanted scriptures, tended to flowers beneath the moon, and patiently awaited the arrival of a new life. Pei Qishuan visited her secretly from time to time, bringing her whatever she needed. When there was nothing urgent, they would sit on a long bench in the courtyard, holding each other under the sun. Those were such good times, undisturbed by anyone. Beneath the dappled sunlight, there were only the two of them, their eyes meeting, their breaths mingling. It was easy to pretend they were in a quiet southern town, with small bridges and flowing streams all around. In dreams, they would meet again. As willows sang, the wine flowed deep. When another harsh winter arrived, Yu Xiaoro was drenched in cold sweat at the Southern Temple, with the midwife rushing around. Her and Pei Qishuan's child was about to be born. Meanwhile, in the palace, upon hearing the news of the Empress Dowager's difficult labor, Pei Qishuan's heart was in a frenzy. He rushed to leave, only to be stopped by Empress Wang. Your Majesty, think carefully. A difficult birth might just be for the best. After all, that's merely the bastard child of the Empress Dowager's affair with some unknown man. Before she could finish, Pei Qishuan's hand slapped across her face. His eyes burned with rage. Don't let me hear such words ever again. Riding through the snow as fast as he could, Pei Qishuan's heart raced. The wind howled, blowing his hair wild. When he finally arrived at the temple, just as his feet touched the ground, he heard the first cry of the newborn. Like the blooming of April flowers, it was a sound more beautiful than all the wealth and splendor in the world. Holding his child in his arms, Pei Qishuan's tears soaked his clothes. He sat at the bedside, tightly clutching Yu Xiaoro's hand. I'm a father now. I'm a father. He repeated the words, overjoyed, over and over again. Xiaoro, with a pale face, smiled through her tears. Yes, and I'm a mother now. At last, I can leave with no regrets. Her words made Pei Qishuan freeze. In disbelief, he looked at her. But Xiao sat up, weakly took the child from his arms, and kissed the baby's forehead, her eyes filled with endless affection. Before the Jade Hall stands a plum tree. For whom does it bloom? For whom does it fall? Only the spring breeze understands its sorrow, coming once a year, then returning once more. She softly recited the poem he had taught her, as if she were soothing the baby, or perhaps wistfully gazing at a spring she could never reach. There was regret in her voice, but also a sense of relief. She had lived too wearily in this life. If it weren't for the attachments she couldn't let go of, she wouldn't have lasted this long. Pei Qishuan had no idea that years of emotional strain had already taken their toll on her. Her body had long been frail, and the injuries she sustained during the battle at the hunting grounds had only worsened over time. She had merely been hanging on. Her body was in no shape to carry a child. This pregnancy had only further depleted her already weakened life. But since that lantern festival, when she hugged him from behind and expressed her wish to have a child for him, she had already made up her mind. She knew she would never live to see the flowers bloom in the south, or bask in the warmth of spring. But she could leave him a child, someone to accompany him in her place. It was her way of fulfilling her last wish. After all, in this fleeting life, she had a husband, a child, and a home. She would not become a wandering soul, lost in the wilderness. This life you and your brother have truly made me suffer. Xiao laughed softly, reaching out to comfort the heartbroken Pei Qishuan, her gaze gradually growing distant. The Pei brothers, one she had loved but could not have, and the other she had won but could not hold. In the end, it was all a dream, a futile pursuit. But at least now she was free. Xiao. His heart-wrenching cry pierced the air above the southern outskirts. One life given, another taken. Inside the room, the lights flickered and the wind howled, making the window shutters creak mournfully. Outside, the snow lay thick and endless, like a vast expanse of white. In the wind echoed a faint verse. Before the Jade Hall stands a plum tree. For whom does it bloom? For whom does it fall? Only the spring breeze understands its sorrow, coming once a year, then returning once more. In the 17th year of Chenghua, Empress Dowager Yu Xiao passed away at the Southern Temple. She was 29. The bewitching empress who captivated two emperors ended up as nothing more than a handful of earth and a patch of grass, leaving behind only a few cryptic lines in history books and a tragic, unforgettable tale.